The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft, golden light over the busy streets. The city buzzed with life, but for Vivian Sinclair, it was just another day of quiet reflection. Tucked into a secluded corner of a downtown park, she sat on the worn bench, dressed in plain clothes that hid the power and wealth she had earned over the years. To the untrained eye, she appeared like any other woman seeking a brief respite from the chaos of the world. But Vivian wasn't just any woman. She was a black billionaire, a self-made success who had clawed her way out of the roughest parts of town to become one of the world's most influential business leaders. Her life had been anything but easy, but it had shaped her into a woman who was both calm under pressure and fiercely protective of her right to live freely. In moments like these, sitting alone and unnoticed, she found peace amidst the whirlwind of her responsibilities. Her thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoing against the empty street. Vivian glanced up, her intuition immediately kicking in. She recognized the approaching figure, a police officer, walking toward her with a deliberate pace, his eyes fixed on her. His expression was cold, and there was something about his posture that felt off, as though he was already sizing her up, ready to pounce. "Hey, you," the officer called out, his voice sharp and mocking. "What do you think you're doing here?" Vivian didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a calm, unwavering look. There was no need to respond immediately, the officer was already on the attack, and she could feel the tension building in the air. "I'm just sitting here," Vivian replied, her voice steady but firm. She made no move to stand, though her body was alert, prepared for whatever might come next. The officer's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "This isn't the place for people like you," he sneered, his words dripping with disdain. "You don't belong here. This is a decent neighborhood." Vivian's jaw tightened, but she kept her posture relaxed. She knew better than to escalate the situation. Years of facing discrimination and prejudice had taught her how to pick her battles. But this man, this officer, was something else. He wasn't just a symbol of authority, he was the embodiment of unchecked power, and in his eyes, Vivian was a target. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, keeping her voice even. "Just sitting. I'm not causing any trouble." The officer's lip curled in a sneer as he circled her, eyeing her from head to toe as though she were something beneath him. "You think you can just sit here like you own the place? Maybe I should teach you a lesson in respect." Vivian felt her muscles tense, but she didn't allow herself to show any sign of fear. Her eyes stayed locked on his, and she resisted the urge to let anger take over. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about the principle, the right to exist freely without harassment. "I'm not standing up," she replied firmly. "I'm not doing anything wrong. You don't have the right to treat me this way." The officer's face turned red, his anger flaring. He took another step closer, his hand subtly hovering over his gun belt. The air felt thicker now, charged with the promise of something that could explode at any moment. "Don't make me do this," he muttered, his voice low and threatening. Vivian's heart beat a little faster, but she kept her calm. She had been in situations like this before, though not quite like this one. She had seen the way power could corrupt, how it could twist the very fabric of a person's soul, and she knew that this officer was no exception. "I'm not moving," she said, each word measured and deliberate. "You can't make me." For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The officer's rage was palpable, his frustration mounting as he reached out and shoved her shoulder, knocking her back slightly on the bench. The force wasn't much, but the intent behind it was clear. He was trying to assert dominance, to make her submit. Vivian's body jerked with the shove, but she caught herself quickly. She stood up in one fluid motion, her face unwavering. "Don't touch me again," she said, her voice cool but filled with authority. The officer's eyes flashed with anger, his jaw tightening. "Who do you think you are?" he spat. "You think you're special? You think you're above the law? I could drag you to the station right now, and no one would bat an eye." Vivian stood tall, her back straight, her eyes locked onto his with the strength of someone who had fought and won many battles. She wasn't about to let this man push her around. Before the situation could escalate further, a voice rang out from behind her. "Take your hands off her, now." Both Vivian and the officer turned to see another man approaching, Daniel Reed, a bystander who had witnessed the entire confrontation. His calm demeanor and unwavering stance immediately set him apart from the tension surrounding them. The officer's eyes flickered with surprise but quickly returned to their cold, challenging glare. "This is none of your business, sir," he warned. But Daniel didn't back down. "It's my business now," he replied, stepping forward with confidence. "I've seen enough. You will not get away with this." The officer hesitated, his grip loosening on Vivian's arm as he exchanged a look of disdain with Daniel. Vivian took a breath, the tension in her chest finally beginning to ease. She wasn't alone anymore. And somehow, that made all the difference. The tension in the air felt thick enough to slice through. Vivian's heart still pounded from the encounter with Officer Walker, her mind racing through the flurry of emotions that swirled inside her. Fear, anger, and defiance all mixed together, but she refused to let any of them show on her face. She stood her ground, her back straight and eyes unwavering as the officer loomed over her. But then, just as things seemed ready to spiral out of control, a new voice interrupted. "Take your hands off her, now." Vivian's gaze snapped to the source of the voice. A man stood a few feet behind her, his posture confident, his eyes sharp. His presence cut through the tension like a knife, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The officer, still gripping Vivian's arm, turned his gaze to the newcomer, his expression darkening. His stance shifted, more aggressive, as though he was daring this man to challenge him. "This is none of your business, sir," Walker growled, his words dripping with hostility. But the man didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his movements deliberate and unshaken. "I think it is my business," he said, his voice steady, with an air of finality that left no room for argument. Vivian's mind raced. She didn't recognize the man, but something about him felt reassuring. He wasn't scared, not one bit. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no sign that he would back down. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere as the officer's authority seemed to waver under the pressure of the stranger's calm resolve. Walker's grip on Vivian's arm tightened momentarily, but he knew he couldn't escalate the situation further without drawing attention. He let out a tight breath, his eyes narrowing into a glare. "You want trouble? You're gonna get it," he threatened, but his words lacked the same force they had held just moments before. The man stood his ground. "I'll take whatever you dish out, but she's not going anywhere." The exchange was brief, but it was enough. Walker let go of Vivian's arm with a reluctant grunt, stepping back just far enough that Vivian could take a deep breath, her body finally starting to relax. She didn't look away from the officer, but her eyes held a subtle hint of gratitude for the man who'd stepped in. "Are you okay?" the stranger asked, his voice softer now. He stepped closer, his gaze genuine, taking in Vivian's appearance with an intensity that told her he wasn't simply concerned about the confrontation but about her well-being. Vivian nodded once, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "I'm fine, thanks to you," she said, her words carrying the weight of someone who had learned long ago that gratitude didn't always come easily. The man smiled slightly, a small, knowing smile. "I couldn't just stand by and watch that happen." He looked back at the officer, his expression hardening. "That man has no right to treat you like that." Vivian's mind was still processing the unexpected turn of events, but she couldn't help but feel a surge of appreciation for this stranger. For a brief moment, she had felt completely alone, but now, she wasn't. "I appreciate your help," she said, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. She wasn't used to people standing up for her like that, especially not in such a direct way. But the way this man had stepped in, without hesitation, it was different. It was real. "Don't mention it," he replied, his tone casual, though there was an unmistakable intensity in his eyes. He glanced at the officer one last time before looking back at Vivian. "I'm Daniel Reed." "And you are?" Vivian hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsure how much to reveal, but she decided there was no harm. "Vivian Sinclair." The name seemed to carry weight in the air, and she noticed Daniel's eyes flicker with recognition, though he didn't let it show. "I've heard of you," he said. "Vivian Sinclair, the business mogul." Vivian nodded, her expression unreadable. "That's me," she said, her voice tinged with irony. It wasn't often she revealed who she was so casually, but in this moment, it felt less like a declaration of status and more like a recognition of her strength. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," Daniel said, his voice full of empathy. He paused, as if debating what to say next. "I saw the whole thing." He wasn't just rude, he was looking for a fight. No one should be treated like that. Vivian sighed, her shoulders relaxing as she took in his words. "I've dealt with a lot worse in my life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But today, it's not about me. It's about people like him who think they can push others around, just because they have the power to do so." Daniel's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he nodded. "I know exactly what you mean. It's messed up. But you don't have to fight this alone. I'll stand with you if you need someone." His offer hung in the air, and Vivian found herself looking at him a little differently. He wasn't just a bystander, a random person stepping in for the sake of a momentary conflict. There was sincerity in his words, an understanding that went beyond the surface. For the first time that day, Vivian felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this fight. "Thank you," she said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I appreciate it." Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "Let's make sure he's held accountable." The sterile, fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly as Vivian sat in the cold, metal chair, her fingers gripping the arms as if they might offer some support. The police station was everything she had imagined, a place where the power dynamics were palpable, the walls closing in with every passing minute. The stench of disinfectant filled the air, mixing with the hum of distant conversations, the clattering of keyboards, and the occasional burst of laughter from officers in the hallway. But for Vivian, none of that mattered now. Her focus was sharp, her mind racing through the events of the past hour. It had been less than an hour since Officer Walker had grabbed her, shoved her, and tried to drag her into this place. Now, as she sat alone, waiting for what came next, she drew strength from the countless obstacles she had overcome in her life. This would be just another battle, a fight for justice. The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and Vivian didn't need to look up to know who it was. She had felt the change in the air as soon as Officer Walker stepped into the room. His presence was undeniable, radiating a sense of entitlement, an arrogant calm that only fueled her inner tension. Walker stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes locking onto hers with a challenge in their depths. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who we have here. Vivian Sinclair, the great businesswoman. You think this little stunt is going to make a difference? That somehow, you're above all of this?" Vivian took a steadying breath, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. "I'm not here because of some stunt," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here because you decided to abuse your power and harass an innocent person." Walker chuckled, the sound bitter. "Innocent? That's rich coming from you. You think because you have money, influence, and power, that you can walk around doing whatever you want, huh?" She met his gaze with a level stare. "I'm here because you decided to treat me like a criminal, simply for sitting on a bench. If that's how you choose to view things, then maybe it's time someone held you accountable." The officer's face tightened with annoyance. He crossed the room slowly, his boots clicking against the floor, and stopped in front of her. "You have no idea who you're messing with, Sinclair. You think you can just waltz in here and play the victim? You don't belong in my world." Vivian held her ground. "It's your world that's broken, Walker. And I'm here to make sure people like you don't get away with it." Walker's eyes flared with anger, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door, slamming it behind him as he left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Vivian exhaled slowly, her pulse still racing. The tension in her chest slowly began to ease, but she knew this was just the beginning. She had no illusions about the system. She had seen how corrupt it could be, how often those in power used their position to control, to belittle, to crush those they deemed beneath them. Vivian knew that this was a battle that would take more than just her strength to win. As she sat in the cold room, her thoughts turned to Daniel. His words, his actions, they had meant more than she could put into words. He had stood by her when she'd been at her lowest point, when she'd been isolated, attacked by a system designed to oppress her. But now, she wasn't alone. She had people who would fight for what was right. The door to the room creaked open again, and this time it wasn't Walker. A tall, imposing woman stepped inside, her dark eyes sharp and calculating. Vivian didn't need an introduction. She knew who this was: Sandra Mills, one of the best lawyers in the country, and someone who had made a name for herself by taking down corrupt systems, brick by brick. Sandra closed the door behind her and set a black briefcase on the table before taking a seat across from Vivian. Her gaze was unwavering, but there was a subtle kindness in her eyes. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're going to be okay," she said, her voice low but firm. "We're going to make sure Walker pays for what he's done." Vivian nodded, feeling a surge of relief flood through her. "I'm ready. I've faced worse than this before, but I won't let it go. Not this time." Sandra's eyes softened for a moment. "I'm glad to hear that. This isn't just about you, Vivian. This is about sending a message. No one should be allowed to abuse their power like that, especially not someone in his position." Vivian's jaw tightened. "I've been targeted before. I've had people try to tear me down just because of who I am, but this is different. He crossed a line. And I'm not letting him get away with it." Sandra reached into her briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "We'll file a lawsuit, get an official statement from Officer Grant, and bring this to the public's attention. We're not letting this go. But I need your full account, Vivian. Every detail. Don't leave anything out." Vivian sat back in her chair, her mind replaying the events that had unfolded earlier. As she began to recount everything, how Walker had approached her, how he had shoved her, and how he had tried to belittle her, she felt the anger rise in her chest again. But this time, it wasn't a reaction. It was resolve. She wasn't just telling her story. She was preparing for the battle ahead. "I'm ready," Vivian said, her voice stronger now. "Let's make sure he never hurts anyone again." Sandra nodded, her eyes glinting with determination. "We'll make sure of it." As Vivian looked up at Sandra, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been wronged, a fight to show that justice could still prevail, no matter how deep the corruption ran. The first step had been taken. And Vivian was ready for the war that was coming. The day dragged on as Vivian sat in the dimly lit room, the hard metal chair beneath her a constant reminder of the battle she was about to fight. The sharp scent of disinfectant hung in the air, mingling with the distant clatter of keyboards and muffled voices from the hallway. It was a strange, sterile environment, the kind that numbed the senses and left you feeling like a mere pawn in someone else's game. But Vivian wasn't a pawn, she was a queen in her own right, and she wasn't about to be controlled by anyone, least of all Officer Walker. As she sat there, replaying the events in her mind, the door to the interrogation room creaked open again. This time, it wasn't Officer Walker. It was someone else entirely, someone who would change the course of everything. "Vivian Sinclair?" The woman's voice was calm, yet there was an unmistakable authority in it. Vivian looked up, and her eyes locked onto the newcomer, Sandra Mills, one of the top criminal defense attorneys in the country. Sandra's presence filled the room with an undeniable intensity. She was tall, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. As she stepped inside, she moved with the confidence of someone who had been in this world long enough to know exactly how it worked. Sandra wasn't here to make small talk. She was here to get results. "Are you the one who's been handling my case?" Vivian asked, her voice steady but edged with curiosity. Sandra nodded, sitting down across from Vivian with a briefcase in hand. "That's right. And we've got a lot of work to do." She placed the case on the table, her eyes narrowing as she studied Vivian with a sharp focus. "I've heard about you, Miss Sinclair. The business world knows your name. But what happened today? This is a whole different fight." Vivian exhaled, leaning back slightly in her chair. "I've dealt with discrimination before, but this was different. Walker didn't just target me because of who I am. He did it because he thinks he can. Because he's above the law. Sandra's expression hardened. And that's exactly why we're here. No one, gets to behave like that without consequences. Vivian nodded, the fire in her chest rekindling at Sandra's words. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. For the first time since the encounter with Walker, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. Sandra opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder filled with documents. First things first, she said, flipping through the pages. We'll need a full account of everything that happened today. Every detail, every interaction. I need you to remember it all, because we're going to hold Walker accountable. Not just for today, but for everything he's done. Vivian took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. The memory of Walker's rough hands on her, the smug look on his face as he shoved her, everything came flooding back. She began recounting the encounter, her words steady but filled with the weight of the anger and humiliation she'd felt. Sandra listened intently, her eyes never leaving Vivian's face as she took notes, capturing every word. There's no excuse for how he treated you, Sandra said, her voice low but full of conviction. We've got a case here, Vivian. A solid one. But we need to be strategic. We can't just go in guns blazing. We'll need to build the narrative, get the evidence, and make sure we have witnesses. Vivian's eyes flickered. Witnesses? Sandra leaned forward, her hands clasped together. Yes. There are people who've seen Officer Walker's behavior. People who know exactly what kind of man he is. And we'll find them. Vivian couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. Sandra wasn't just a lawyer, she was a warrior, and in this moment, she was fighting for Vivian like no one ever had. And what about Officer Grant? Vivian asked, remembering the officer who had spoken out against Walker. He knows what Walker has done. He could help. Sandra nodded. I've already spoken to him. He's hesitant, understandably so. Going up against a fellow officer isn't easy. But he's seen enough to know that what Walker did today was wrong. We just need to convince him to testify. The idea of someone from the inside coming forward was both comforting and unsettling. Vivian knew how much courage it would take for Officer Grant to stand up to Walker, but she also knew that it was a crucial piece of the puzzle. We'll give him the support he needs, Sandra added. But we can't waste time. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to build momentum. This needs to go public, and it needs to happen soon. Vivian's heart raced as she realized the enormity of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about shining a light on an abusive system that had been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long. Walker's actions were a symptom of something much bigger, and Vivian was determined to expose it all. Sandra closed the folder with a snap, her eyes meeting Vivian's. We'll file the lawsuit, and we'll make sure the press gets involved. I'm going to take this as far as it goes. We're going to bring Walker down. Vivian felt a sense of purpose settle over her like a blanket. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in this. She had allies now, people who believed in her and the cause. And together, they were going to make sure justice prevailed. Let's do it, Vivian said, her voice full of conviction. Let's make sure Walker never hurts anyone again. Sandra smiled, a rare moment of warmth breaking through her otherwise stoic demeanor. That's the spirit. We're just getting started. As Vivian stood up, ready to face the next phase of this battle, she felt a sense of determination surge through her. This was no longer about her alone. It was about everyone who had ever been oppressed, silenced, or overlooked. And Vivian Sinclair was no longer just a business mogul, she was a symbol of change. The press conference room was brimming with tension. The walls seemed to close in as the camera flashes flashed relentlessly, blinding everyone in its path. Journalists jostled for position, scribbling down notes, whispering among themselves. The weight of the moment was palpable. Vivian Sinclair, the billionaire businesswoman who had just become the center of a growing storm, was about to speak. Vivian sat at the podium, feeling the sharp pangs of anxiety deep in her stomach, but she pushed them aside. She had faced bigger challenges, and this was no different. Today wasn't about her wealth or status, It was about standing up for what was right. She was no longer just a business leader, she was a symbol for something much larger: justice. Sandra Mills sat beside her, calm and collected, her hands folded neatly on the table, her eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. Behind them, Daniel stood near the back, his eyes fixed on Vivian with an unspoken message of support. They were all here for one reason: to make sure Vivian's voice was heard. The moderator cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. We have Ms. Vivian Sinclair, who will be addressing the press regarding the incident earlier this week with Officer Bryce Walker of the local police department. Ms. Sinclair, please go ahead." The room fell silent as Vivian stood up. Her hands were steady as she adjusted the microphone in front of her. For a brief moment, her gaze swept across the room, hundreds of eyes staring at her, waiting for her to speak. She took a deep breath and began. "I stand here today, not just as a businesswoman, but as someone who has had enough of the systemic abuse of power that continues to plague our society," Vivian began, her voice steady and strong, but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "What happened to me earlier this week isn't just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much larger problem, one that's been ignored for far too long." Her words hung in the air as the room absorbed her message. Vivian could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the judgment, the curiosity, but she couldn't let it faze her. This was bigger than any of them. This was about a fight for justice, and she was going to make sure people listened. "I was treated with disrespect and aggression, simply for existing in a public space," Vivian continued, her eyes flashing with anger, though she kept her voice measured. "Officer Walker singled me out, not because I had done anything wrong, but because he thought he could. Because people like him believe they can get away with it. That they can dictate who belongs and who doesn't." The room was still, no one daring to interrupt. Vivian could hear the murmurs of agreement from the back of the room, the subtle shifting of the journalists in their seats. She pressed on. "But this isn't just about me," Vivian said, her voice rising with conviction. "This is about every person who's ever been looked down upon, who's been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their status. This is about the countless people who have been silenced by the very system that is supposed to protect them." Her words resonated deeply with the audience, and she could see some of the journalists nodding in quiet agreement. The tension in the room had shifted. This wasn't just a story about an incident with a police officer. This was a story about power, abuse, and the need for accountability. As a society, we cannot continue to allow individuals like Officer Walker to perpetuate this kind of behavior, Vivian stated firmly. "We cannot allow it to become the norm. I'm not here to just speak for myself. I'm here to speak for everyone who's ever been pushed down, ignored, or dismissed." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, as though the room was holding its breath. A journalist in the front row raised his hand, and Vivian nodded toward him. "Miss Sinclair, do you feel this is a personal attack, or do you think this is a larger issue with law enforcement?" Vivian didn't hesitate. "It's both," she replied, her voice unwavering. "This is personal, yes. But it's also systemic. The issue here isn't just about one officer. It's about an entire culture of abuse that's been allowed to thrive unchecked. Officer Walker may be the one I'm standing against today, but he's just a reflection of a much bigger problem." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I'm not here to tear down the entire police force," Vivian added, her voice softening just slightly, but still firm. "But I am here to hold people accountable for their actions. And right now, Officer Walker is not above the law. He needs to face the consequences for his behavior, and I will make sure of that." The room erupted into whispers, the journalists scribbling frantically in their notebooks, eager to capture her every word. Vivian could feel the eyes of the world on her, but she didn't flinch. She had already made up her mind. This was just the beginning. "I'm not backing down," she said, her voice strong once more. "This isn't just my fight. It's for anyone who's ever been treated like they don't matter. This is for justice." The moderator thanked her, but the room was still alive with energy. Journalists shot questions at her from every direction, but Vivian was resolute. She had said what she came to say, and she would let the world take it from here. As the press conference ended and the crowd dispersed, Vivian exhaled a long, slow breath. She had done what she came to do. But this was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. Sandra placed a hand on her shoulder, her eyes filled with pride. "You did great," she said quietly, but Vivian could hear the admiration in her voice. Vivian turned to Daniel, who gave her a small, approving nod. "You're not alone in this," he said. Vivian nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wasn't alone anymore. And no matter how difficult the road ahead was, she was ready to face it. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of feet and the occasional scribble of a pen. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the weight of the trial pressing down on every person in the room. The case had quickly become a media sensation, and today was the day that the truth would be laid bare. Vivian Sinclair sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her eyes focused. She knew that what happened in this room today would set a precedent, not just for her, but for everyone who had been silenced and oppressed by systems of power. Sandra Mills sat beside her, exuding calm confidence. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the room, noting every detail, every shift in the room's energy. She had been in countless trials, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, for the very soul of the system. Vivian could hear the buzz of the spectators behind her, but she refused to turn around. She had a job to do. The judge, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, called the court to order. The sound of his gavel echoed through the room, signaling the beginning of the day's proceedings. "Court is now in session," he said, his voice gravelly. "The case of Vivian Sinclair versus Officer Bryce Walker will now proceed." The defense team, led by a tall, stern-looking attorney, rose to their feet. Vivian couldn't help but notice the way their demeanor shifted when they looked at her. There was no respect in their gaze, only the cold, calculating eyes of people determined to defend the indefensible. Sandra stood up first, her presence commanding the room. "Your Honor, we will be presenting evidence today that demonstrates a clear abuse of power by Officer Walker. We intend to prove that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger issue within the system. This isn't just about what happened to Miss Sinclair. It's about accountability." The words hung in the air as the defense attorney made his opening statement, his tone dismissive, almost mocking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is a misunderstanding. Officer Walker did what he thought was necessary. Miss Sinclair, despite her wealth and influence, is not above the law. What happened was an unfortunate series of events, and we will show you that this is not a case of racial discrimination or police brutality." Vivian's blood boiled as she listened to his words, but she kept her face neutral, her jaw clenched. She knew that this was just the beginning of a long battle, and her emotions couldn't afford to take over. Sandra shot her a quick, reassuring glance, as if to say, "Stay focused." The trial proceeded with witness testimony. Sandra called Officer Grant to the stand, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Vivian's heart pounded in her chest as the officer stepped up, his uniform freshly pressed, his face a mix of determination and regret. Vivian knew that Officer Grant had been a reluctant witness, unsure of the consequences of speaking out. But she also knew that the truth had a way of coming out, no matter how hard you tried to suppress it. "Officer Grant," Sandra began, her voice steady but full of authority, "can you tell the court what you witnessed the day of the incident?" Grant hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice low. "I was on duty when I saw Officer Walker confronting Miss Sinclair. I knew there was no reason for it. She wasn't breaking any laws, she wasn't causing any trouble. But Walker seemed to have something against her from the start. I've seen his behavior before, he has a history of targeting people based on their appearance." The room seemed to hold its breath as Grant's words sank in. Vivian's grip on the edge of the table tightened, but she remained still, her gaze never wavering from the officer on the stand. "What exactly did you see him do?" Sandra pressed, her eyes unwavering. "I saw him shove her. He grabbed her arm and tried to drag her to the patrol car. There was no reason for it. I was there, and I knew it wasn't right. But I didn't know what to do at the time. I stayed quiet, hoping it would blow over." Vivian's heart sank. She had hoped for a stronger stand from Grant, but his reluctance was understandable. He was in the midst of a corrupt system, and speaking out wasn't easy. But the fact that he had come forward, despite his fears, was something. "Thank you, Officer Grant," Sandra said softly. "You've done the right thing." The defense attorney stood up, objecting. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant to the case at hand. We're here to discuss the actions of Officer Walker, not the witness's personal opinions about his fellow officer." The judge waved the objection aside. "Overruled. Continue." Sandra nodded and turned back to Grant. "Officer Grant, you mentioned that this wasn't the first time you had seen Officer Walker behave this way. Have you ever reported these actions before?" Grant shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. "I've tried to report him, but nothing ever came of it. There's a lot of pressure to stay quiet. It's not easy, you know, when the system is set up to protect people like him." The words hit hard, and the courtroom seemed to collectively exhale, the weight of the moment sinking in. Vivian's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about Officer Walker, it was about the system that allowed him to thrive unchecked. The defense attorney scoffed, clearly unsettled by the shift in momentum. "We are here to talk about the actions of Miss Sinclair's arrest, not the supposed misconduct of other officers," he said, his voice strained. Sandra's eyes narrowed. "And yet, this is the very behavior we are talking about. This is part of the larger issue. Officer Walker's abuse of power isn't an isolated case. It's part of a culture that tolerates this kind of conduct. And it's time to expose it." The jury looked on, some faces troubled, others more resolute. Vivian could feel the tide turning, but she knew that the road ahead was still long. There would be more challenges, more delays, and more attempts to undermine the truth. As the day wore on, the evidence continued to mount against Officer Walker. Sandra's arguments were sharp, her delivery flawless. Vivian could sense the shift in the courtroom, the growing realization that this wasn't just another case, it was a turning point. As the session ended and the room emptied, Vivian stood up, her body feeling heavy with exhaustion. But there was something else beneath it all, a sense of purpose. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. She turned to Sandra. "Thank you for everything," she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. Sandra gave her a small smile. "This is just the beginning, Vivian. We're in this together." Vivian nodded, her heart brimming with determination. The fight wasn't over. But today, they had taken a crucial step forward. The courtroom was still, a heavy silence filling the air. The weight of the moment hung over everyone like a thick fog. Vivian Sinclair sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting in her lap, her back straight, but her mind was anything but calm. The trial had lasted days, and now, after hours of testimony, evidence, and arguments, the jury was deliberating. Sandra Mills, Vivian's steadfast lawyer, sat beside her, flipping through notes with a quiet intensity. Daniel, standing behind them, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but Vivian could feel the tension radiating off him. It was the same for everyone in the room, the feeling that the outcome of this trial would send ripples far beyond the courtroom walls. It had been a long and exhausting journey. From the moment Officer Walker had accosted her in the street, to the press conference where she had spoken her truth, to the courtroom where Officer Grant had given his reluctant testimony, every step had felt like an uphill battle. But this was different. The jury's verdict would determine whether the system that had enabled Walker's behavior would remain untouched or whether it would crack open and expose its flaws to the light. Vivian glanced at the clock. The jury had been deliberating for over 3 hours now. Every second felt like an eternity. The judge, a quiet man with a stern face, sat at his bench, watching the door as if willing the jury to return. "You okay?" Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. He had been by her side since the very beginning, through every moment of uncertainty, every piece of bad news. She could see the same concern in his eyes that had been there when she'd first met him, the desire to make sure she was all right. Vivian nodded, though the anxiety gnawing at her insides betrayed her calm appearance. "I'm just waiting," she said quietly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. I don't know if I can do this anymore. It feels like I've been fighting my whole life, and now it's in their hands. You've already done everything you can, Daniel said, his voice firm. You've stood up for yourself. For everyone. That's more than anyone could ask of you. Vivian gave a small, appreciative smile but didn't respond. The words felt empty. She wasn't sure if this was just her fight anymore. She had come to realize that this was a fight for everyone who had been oppressed, ignored, and mistreated by those who were supposed to protect them. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for a world where people like Officer Walker couldn't walk around unchecked. The door to the jury room opened, and the foreman walked in, his expression grave. A collective hush swept through the room, and the tension became almost unbearable. The foreman's eyes scanned the room before he turned to the judge and nodded. Your Honor, the foreman began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of uncertainty. We, the jury, have reached a verdict. The judge motioned for him to proceed. Please read the verdict. Vivian's breath hitched as she tried to keep her focus on the foreman. Every muscle in her body was taut with expectation. It was finally here. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Bryce Walker, guilty on all counts of misconduct, abuse of power, and unlawful detention. For a split second, Vivian couldn't process the words. The room seemed to spin around her, and she felt the air rush out of her lungs. The silence that followed the foreman's statement was deafening. Then, slowly, it began to sink in. Guilty. She had won. The floodgates opened. There were gasps from the spectators, some breaking into soft applause. Vivian sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about accountability, about exposing the truth for what it was, and about making sure that people like Officer Walker couldn't get away with hurting others without consequence. Beside her, Sandra exhaled, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Daniel placed a hand on Vivian's shoulder, his voice low but filled with a mixture of pride and relief. You did it. Vivian's throat tightened, and she finally allowed herself to breathe again. Her eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, unwilling to let the moment of triumph slip into weakness. She had fought too hard for that. The judge banged his gavel. This court is adjourned. Officer Walker will be sentenced at a later date, but for now, his actions have been deemed unlawful. As the courtroom slowly came to life, people began to murmur excitedly, discussing the verdict. The media frenzy was only beginning, but Vivian barely noticed it. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. It was over. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. She had stood her ground, and now, there was proof that justice could prevail. Sandra leaned in and spoke softly. We still have a long way to go. But today, we've made history. Vivian nodded, her eyes scanning the room. She could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of this victory. But she also knew that this was only one battle in a war. There were still more to fight, more injustices to expose, more systems to tear down. As they walked out of the courtroom, the cheers and applause from the crowd seemed to fade into the background. Vivian felt a strange calm wash over her. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Let's make sure we keep fighting, she said, her voice steady with a new resolve. Sandra nodded, and Daniel smiled at her, both of them knowing that Vivian Sinclair was not someone who would rest until every last shred of injustice was eradicated. Today, she had taken a major step forward. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, she would keep pushing. The day after the trial was a strange quiet. The constant buzz of media coverage, the endless calls from reporters, and the steady stream of messages from well-wishers had finally slowed down. Vivian Sinclair sat by her office window, the sunlight streaming in, but it didn't feel like the end of something, it felt like the beginning. The weight of the victory still hung heavy in her chest, but there was something else now, a sense of purpose she had never felt before. She had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for countless others. The battle had been hard-fought, but it had opened her eyes to a much larger world of injustice that needed attention. Daniel stood across the room, his gaze thoughtful as he stared out at the city skyline. "It still doesn't feel real, does it?" he asked, his voice a little distant. He hadn't said much since the verdict, but his presence had been a constant support. "You've spent so much of your life fighting for your place at the table. Now, the whole world knows your name." Vivian didn't respond immediately. She was still processing everything. "I've spent my life building a company, a legacy," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "But this is something different. It's not just about power. It's about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Daniel turned to face her, his brow furrowing slightly. "And what happens next? Do you keep pushing for more?" Vivian smiled, a small, determined smile that conveyed more than words could. "This isn't the end. It's just one step. I can't stop now, not when I've seen how much work there is to do." Her phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a message from Sandra. "The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow. It's time to make the next move. Are you ready?" Vivian glanced at Daniel, who gave her a quiet nod. He knew exactly what that meant. This fight wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. The next morning, Vivian stood at the podium again, but this time it was different. The crowd of journalists was larger than ever, their cameras poised and ready to capture every word. The room was buzzing with excitement, the anticipation palpable. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, but there was no fear now. There was only resolve. "Good morning," Vivian began, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you all for coming today. Yesterday was a victory, but I'm here today to tell you that the real work starts now." She paused for a moment, scanning the room. Every journalist in the room was hanging on her every word. Yesterday's verdict wasn't just a judgment against one officer, Vivian continued. It was a statement. It said that we will no longer tolerate abuse of power. It said that no one, has the right to use their position to harm others, especially those who cannot defend themselves. The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'm not just talking about one police officer," Vivian pressed, her voice growing stronger. "I'm talking about a system that allows this kind of behavior to thrive. I'm talking about policies and institutions that turn a blind eye to abuse. We cannot continue to ignore the problem. We cannot allow this to keep happening." She took a breath, steadying herself. She wasn't just talking for herself anymore, she was talking for everyone who had been oppressed, ignored, and silenced. She was talking for the countless people who had been targeted simply because of the way they looked, where they came from, or who they were. "The fight doesn't end with one verdict," Vivian said, her eyes locking with the cameras. "We need reform. We need transparency. We need accountability. And we will not stop until we get it." The room remained still as Vivian finished her statement. The impact of her words had settled into the space, and for the first time, she felt that something truly important was happening. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a world where everyone had the same right to justice. As she stepped away from the podium, Sandra approached her, her face a picture of pride. "You did it," Sandra said, her voice soft but full of admiration. Vivian smiled, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "We did it. But this is only the beginning. I have a long way to go, and so do we." "Exactly," Sandra agreed, her eyes flashing with the same intensity that Vivian had seen when they first started working together. "You've set something in motion, Vivian. People are watching. And change is coming." Daniel stepped forward, his smile warm but tired. "I've always known you were more than just a businesswoman," he said, his voice genuine. "You're a force. And now, everyone knows it." Vivian's heart swelled with gratitude. She had always prided herself on her ability to keep pushing forward, to rise above the challenges that life had thrown her way. But now, she realized that she wasn't just pushing for herself. She was pushing for something bigger, something that could change the world for the better. "The work doesn't stop here," Vivian said, turning to face both Sandra and Daniel. "This is just the first step. We need to continue to fight, to expose the truth, and to make sure that every person who has been mistreated or silenced gets a chance to be heard. We need to hold those in power accountable. Sandra nodded. And we will. Vivian walked out of the conference room, her mind racing with the possibilities. She had started this journey with a simple desire for justice, but now she was at the forefront of something much bigger. A movement had been born, and it was up to her to make sure it didn't fade away. The road ahead was uncertain, but Vivian knew one thing for sure: she was no longer just a businesswoman. She was a leader in a fight for justice, and she wasn't stopping until the job was done.